Hey class, Alan Munsell here, talking to you today about Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's John Winthrop's City of Women. What Laurel Thatcher Ulrich attempts to do in this passage that she writes is talk about women in Puritan society and really begin to dispel a lot of notions about the patriarchal nature of women in Puritan society. The first thing that she wants people to understand is that not all Puritans viewed women in the same light as some of their leaders. John Winthrop is one particular opinion, and that's the one that she really spends a lot of time talking about in and through his writings. So what we often hear about women in early Puritan society is that they were oppressed, they had no rights, they had no ability to access any civil engagement, that they really had no power within the society. And what she says is that that's not really the case. We often talk about Anne Hutchinson because that is one of the best case studies that we have of women within this early society. So Anne Hutchinson comes along and she begins to have gatherings in her home, and talk and relate things about the Bible, like specifically indwelling. So the idea of the Holy Spirit coming down and being able to talk to people regardless of social status, regardless of race, regardless of gender. So it's important to note that what she's actually preaching, Anne Hutchinson is preaching or discussing within these gatherings, is rather inflammatory for the time, because what it means is it undercuts a lot of the social structure that exists if anyone can actually be spoken to by God. Now, that being said, within Puritan society, they did encourage laymen learning about biblical topics. They didn't want people to be uneducated. They allowed reading, they allowed understanding within reason. Now, what Anne Hutchinson does kind of operates outside of that. So in her initial gatherings, they're pretty small, and women were allowed to gather. Oftentimes, as pointed out in John Winthrop's writings, it's around childbirth, it's around children, it's around, just prayer meetings and such. But what Anne Hutchinson does is a little bit different. These gatherings get very large, and they get to the point where she's actually preaching her own ideas on biblical interpretations in a way that hadn't been done before. But in addition to that, men had begun to actually show up at these gatherings. So women were allowed to gather, and even men were allowed to gather in some contexts. But where Anne Hutchinson is it's about 80 people, which is a lot of people at the time. And what John Winthrop says is that this no longer is a private meeting. This is no longer a private gathering, and that's what makes it unacceptable, is that it's actually in the public sphere, which Anne Hutchinson should not be able to engage in as a woman. And that being said, it's also important to note that women did have a large role to play within the public sphere. Just not directly, it's kind of indirectly. In Amanda Porterfield's Women's Attraction to Puritanism, she actually asks this fundamental question, which is, if Puritanism was so patriarchal and so oppressive of women, why did any women go along with it? Well, she answers it pretty well. What she says is that women actually had the ability to choose, that they had social pressure to exert based on their status, based on the wealth that they had within the society. Women actually had a large role to play in that. In the example that she gives is that women had a large role to play in actually the pastors that were chosen within Puritan society, because they could exert pressure on their husbands, they could exert pressure onto the rest of the society, and oftentimes their membership within Puritan churches actually outweighed that of men. Within that, too, she also notes that women were able to choose their husbands, but once that husband was chosen, the idea was that they should submit to that husband's will, and that he was now the leader of the family. That being said, by being able to choose in the first place, they actually had a lot of ability to involve themselves in their society as a whole. What she also talks about with Anne Hutchinson specifically is that John Winthrop's issues with her really stemmed also from her inability to take on traditional Puritan values of not necessarily being completely certain in her faith. So when she has an earthquake that happens during one of her prayer meetings, she says that it's like the will of God and essentially the Spirit coming down and showing themselves in the context of this meeting. But what John Winthrop says is that she's not actually examining what the will of God is, and is instead attributing certain things to natural occurrences that don't really exist. And so that's another part of the issue that John Winthrop has with Anne Hutchinson. But in addition to that, Ulrich also talks specifically about women in John Winthrop's time period not oftentimes being tried as witches. So, this has become a very kind of neutral phase. Women aren't witches, but they're also not like these pious creatures yet. They're kind of in a neutral phase when we're talking about early Puritanism. But in addition to this, within household affairs, she very much looks to what Amanda Porterfield says, which is men lead, women follow. There's not really any gender specific unless women aren't doing their fair share of household duties. In addition to this, she does note that there is something that is unique within Winthrop's writings that is a specific gender, and that comes to sexual sins. She says, in fact, that sexual sins were often male-dominated, that the role of men were to protect women, and that if that was not done, that oftentimes fell on men, and then men who preyed on women were specifically very harshly punished within Puritan society. So there were some things that were gendered, but in fact it harmed men oftentimes more than it helped them. In addition to this, Puritan views were all different, and that's something that Ulrich really wants you to understand, and kind of what she leaves you with is that women, she gives the parable of like the woman falling into the river and the man not being able to help her. So within a household, men are supposed to lead, women are supposed to follow, but ultimately men don't have the ability to save women. That is God's job. And so that's really where she comes to a conclusion on what Puritanism is. So I hope this was interesting. Hope it gave you perspective. I think that women wouldn't have participated in Puritanism if it wasn't at least somewhat of an egalitarian society where they had some role to play. Thanks.